We have just released issue 4 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine. Download it for free at newthinkingaloud.org.
New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is how spirituality can enhance mental health. My guest is David Rosmarin, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, a program director at McLean Hospital Spirituality and Mental Health Program, and founder of the Center for Anxiety in New York. He is an international expert on spirituality and mental health. He has authored over 50 peer-reviewed publications and 100 abstracts focused on spirituality and mental health. He is author of Thriving with Anxiety, 9 Tools to Make Your Anxiety Work for You, Spirituality, Religion, and Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, A Guide for Clinicians, The Connections Paradigm, Ancient Jewish Wisdom for Modern Mental Health, From Crisis to Connection, and co-author of Handbook of Spirituality, Religion, and Mental Health, and Handbook of Torah and Mental Health. David is located in the Boston area. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for being with me on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thanks for having me.
Spirituality is often dismissed or ignored in psychiatry, among mental health professionals, and even across the board in healthcare, yet your research has shown that it can be very beneficial for people dealing with many mental health challenges.
Indeed. There's I'd like to say a challenging history between spirituality and the field of psychiatry. It really goes back to the days of Sigmund Freud, who was virulently anti-spiritual, anti-religious, anti-anything metaphysical in any way. And those ideas really took root in the field, such that for the better part of in fact, almost the entirety of the 20th century, this topic was almost entirely ignored, to your point.
You have done research in this area, and what have you discovered?
Well, it might be interesting to tell you how we got there, because this really came about, this program of research, and I would say also clinical innovation, because one of the things I do, in addition to studying spirituality and its relevance to mental health, is trying to teach clinicians how to address this topic, how to actually wade into the spiritual lives of patients, which are often an area that they want to discuss, that they want to get involved in, and clinicians don't have a lot of training. So, I think the how we got here might be a cool starting point, because, this really came up from the patients themselves, who, when we started sampling our patients and started doing some research in this area, this is in Eastern Massachusetts, okay? Not the most religious enclave in the entire country by any stretch, in the entire world, I should say, by any stretch. And 60% of our patients, nearly 60%, 58.2 exactly percent of our patients stated that they had significant desire to speak with their clinicians about spiritual matters. So it's the kind of topic that, yes, the field ignores, but that is not the case on the ground among our patients, which is quite fascinating.
Right. And a high percentage of Americans either believe in God or pray, or like you say, they want it to be addressed as part of their healthcare. Yet many clinicians are either not trained well, or they have their own personal biases that can get in the way.
Yeah, I think the biases are less today. I really do think we've sort of entered a postmodern era, and especially in psychiatry, which is very forward thinking, and it kind of needs to be. We've really entered into a chapter where there isn't a lot of judgment, but I do think that there isn't a lot of attention paid to this because of a lack of training. Clinicians today and researchers really don't know how to assess, how to measure aspects of spirituality, how to address these in the context of psychiatric research and practice. So to me, those are really the main barriers to the provision of spiritual integrated care and further research on the subject, as well as funding, of course.
Yeah. In what ways have you found that spirituality can enhance mental health?
There are enhancements, if you will, and then there also are detriments. So it's very much at the outset, I do want to say it's a double-edged sword. Spirituality, like any area of life, in fact, it has positive and negative effects. We have some interesting findings, though, that we've seen over time. One of them is that patients who have more faith in God, faith in anything, also have more faith in their treatment. They have more faith that their treatment team will be able to help them, even if the treatment is completely secular, even if they do not receive spiritual care at all during their treatment, during the course of treatment that they receive. Patients who are in acute psychiatric crisis will draw upon faith in something greater as a way of maintaining hope that they can get better, that they can pull out, that there is a meaning to the suffering and sometimes excruciating suffering that they are experiencing. And all of those are parlayed during the treatment process such that patients who have those beliefs in place, intact, are better able to believe that their treatment team will help them. They're better able to believe that they can be helped, which in turn, as you can imagine, does have a discernible effects on reductions of anxiety and reductions of depression, a less risk like self-harm and self-injury, less suicidality, and other significant clinical effects.
They have more faith in their healing and their practitioners. And you mentioned a word, belief, that I think that's really behind a lot of what we're talking about, isn't it? Is what does a person believe? And that can really impact not only mental health, but also physical health, because the two really are intertwined.
Yes, very much so. I think as one of my mentors put it, belief or faith in something greater can generalize to belief or faith in treatment, that, one's treatment can be effective. And I think that is very well put. Not everybody, though, has that concept of belief. For some people, it's much more experiential. And it's much more simply, even by rote. It could simply be a set of practices that people have, which is in some ways even devoid of faith. And what we found recently is another positive effect even there. People who are from religious backgrounds, even if they're not, brimming with, verbal expressions of faith that I believe, or I'm going to be hope, I have faith, I have a connection. Even in the absence of those, if people maintain fidelity, faith, if you will, to a set of religious practices, such as going to religious services on a weekly basis, praying on a daily basis, having certain culture-driven religious behaviors that they engage in on a regular basis, those tend to have another effect, which is that they tend to tamp down people's impulsivity. So such individuals who are involved in any faith tradition, even in the absence of that belief, as long as they're practicing, they tend to be less impulsive, tend to be less involved in substance abuse, alcohol abuse is substantially less, and most of all, they tend to be less suicidal. Completed suicide among people who go to religious services on a weekly basis is 1/5 the level of people who do not, which is a astounding effect. And that's something that some of my colleagues have identified.
Wow. And what do you attribute that to? Certainly there's the belief component. It also seems that people participate in religious organizations for social connections and community.
Yeah, there is the social connection and then there's the community. There's another thing, though, which is that religious behavior or religious engagement, if you will, is a way of regulating one's life. And that regulation obviously is a double-edged sword, and there can be some downsides to it, and there can be some very complex aspects to it. But in our, I mentioned, post-modern era, in the secular world today, there is a tendency, I would say, of people to, in some ways, lose their identity, to lose their compass, and to say, who am I? What do I do? And really not to have grounded elements of their life. And religious practice, to some degree, even in the absence of faith, tends to ground people such that it's not all things go. It's not no holds barred. There are certain pegs within the weekly cycle, within the daily cycle, that anchor a person. And that has a psychological effect of, I'm not just going to, engage in substance abuse or alcohol abuse or suicidality and other impulsive behaviors. I shouldn't say not, I should say less likely to, because it's not obvious. Obviously, there are religious individuals many who struggle with these issues, but the effect sizes are quite large, which really does raise some interesting questions.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the benefits of spirituality for mental health, can you share some more of what those can be for people? Because those listening might be thinking, I've tried this, I've done that, and maybe they found certain components that help, but maybe what you might have to offer could assist them.
I'm reluctant to prescribe aspects of spirituality and religion in order to deal with mental health. At the same time, I do think there are really two main effects, like we spoke about: hope, faith, meaning, connection, I would say, is one, which is more cognitive. And then the other is the impulsivity buffer, which is more behavioral, where people are engaged in faith-based activities. They have fidelity to those activities. That tends to ground people more. Interestingly, individuals who are spiritual but not religious do not have the latter benefits. They are equally likely as people who are secular to have issues with substance abuse, alcohol abuse, suicidality, self-injury, and the like. So there are behavioral elements to religion or to spirituality, and then there are cognitive elements of spirituality and religion. And I think the general effects really map onto those two domains, if you will, of spiritual life. And they are discernible positive impacts. Although, like I said before, it's not, there are definitely some struggles as well that people have.
You mentioned some ways that spirituality can have a positive impact, and we'll definitely get to some of the detrimental effects here in a moment. Some that you mentioned make a lot of sense, and I'm also wondering if in your research you found that it also helped people to feel that they were less alone, that maybe they were more connected versus feeling separate.
Yeah, certainly. I think that in some ways transcends the cognitive and behavioral. It's more of an experiential aspect of it. Where people feel or have a sense or a palpable, sometimes it's not even, sometimes it can't even be articulated, that I'm not alone in the universe. And in some ways that's an aspect of it that, like I said, I think it arises out of both behavioral aspects where people are, engaged, and also cognitive aspects where people maintain faith and hope in something greater, and they're less likely to feel alone. So to your point, I certainly concur that that's in many ways at the core of what spirituality does, psychologically speaking.
Well, it also depends on a person's definition of spirituality. You mentioned you want to stay away from prescribing it, and I agree with you. I think that it's a very individual experience for everyone. Maybe that's why we have so many different religions, or people. It seems to be a very growing population or trend, the people who identify as spiritual but not religious. So what is the definition that you tend to work with, or that seems to work the most in your framework about spirituality?
Yeah, I'm happy to share. I did get it from my graduate mentor, and it's sort of the most commonly used definition of spirituality and religion in the field. But I do want to mention something important before we get into definitions. I have never had a patient, unless they had two advanced degrees or more, ask me about defining spirituality and religion. This is very much in the realm of like an intellectual sort of way of approaching the topic. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I myself, as an academician, certainly have written about this and I've spoken about this. But these are usually conversations that are much more germane to the realm of practitioners, to the realm of theologians, to the realm of theoreticians, philosophers, then to actual patients who are struggling with their mental health. And the reason why I mention this is because often the conversation sort of spins out into philosophy, as opposed to what's really happening on the ground for patients who are anxious and sad and feeling despondent and feeling disconnected and struggling with their substances or their substance abuse or alcohol abuse. So they feel self-loathing because they're engaging in these behaviors and they feel like they can't stop it. And spirituality in those moments, none of those patients are asking, how do you define God? That just doesn't come up. What comes up is, hey, I really want to access this more. I don't know how. What can I do? And that's where the magic, if you will, happens in spiritual integrated psychotherapy, where we're able to provide for these patients and provide spiritual care, also chaplaincy. Mental health chaplaincy is another thing that our hospital is really doing. McLean Hospital is doing in a grand scale, much more than the theory. Now, with that long preamble, I'm happy to answer your question, but I did want to make it clear that these are the kind of conversations that come up at conferences, not in the therapy room.
Mm-hmm. Well, and people have different ideas of what spirituality means for them. So since you are an expert in this area, I was just curious how you frame it and how you framed it within your service with patients, but also with your research and when you are speaking about it.
Sure, yeah. And it is more to the academics that this conversation is germane. Spirituality is anyway, I'll quote from my graduate school mentor, Dr. Kenneth Pargament, who I worked with for many years. Still, he's a close friend. At Bowling Green State University. And he came up with the idea that spirituality is any way, very broad definition, of any way at all of relating to that which is sacred being set apart from the physical world. So anything that is perceived to having some sort of a metaphysical quality has spiritual value, spiritual engagement. If I perceive my hand, for example, to have some sort of metaphysical aspect, even if it's only in part, then my hand could have spiritual significance. And the searching for significance in the realm of the sacred is really the act of moving into the realm of spirituality. Now, religion is a subset of spirituality. So spirituality would be the larger construct, and religion is a subset of that. And that involves any culture-bound ways of relating to the sacred. So if you belong to a group of people who all define something metaphysical in a certain way and have certain ways of relating to that metaphysical body, entity, non-physical, non-corporeal structure, for many people we call it God. For other people, they might use other words or concepts even. But any way of relating to that which is within a culture-bound manner is considered religion. And what you end up here is really three groups. You have people who are spiritual and religious. You have people who are spiritual but not religious. And then you have people who are neither spiritual nor religious, predominantly, according to these definitions and according to this group. And statistically speaking, that accounts for more than 99% of, at least in the United States, people who will fall into one of those three groups. The largest group are religious and spiritual. The second largest, which is a growing group, are the people who are spiritual but not religious. And then the smallest are people who are neither spiritual nor religious.
I love that definition of being set apart, the sacred from the physical, and recognizing that we are more than this seemingly physical world. So what have you found in your research as far as, people are dealing with all sorts of ways that their experiences can impact their ability to function, their thoughts. So there's, of course, anxiety. I know you have written a whole book about that. There's mood disorders, depression, bipolar, people who are self-harming, people who are considering suicide, psychotic disorders, eating disorders, like you mentioned, substance use, behavioral addictions, pain, end-of-life care, which I imagine is a big area where people begin really exploring,
Sure.
if they haven't already, spirituality as well. So what have your outcomes shown with improvements with spirituality with these different groups?
Well, it's interesting. The first point to make in this is that when people bring a religious lens to psychotherapy, even if they're provided with secular treatment, that treatment has spiritual meaning. And we've had some interesting findings and seen this in other laboratories as well, where people who go through secular treatment having nothing to do with spiritual and religious life, if they have spiritual beliefs at the beginning of treatment, those will actually increase over the course of the treatment that they are receiving. I think it happens for two reasons. The one is that if you have a spiritual message, even if you're speaking to someone who's not religious, who's not spiritual, who's secular, and they're providing you with messages, you're going to filter it through your lens of spirituality. And the other thing is when people have a reduction in their symptoms and they are having an improved mood, it's easier for them to access that which they value and that which they believe. Conversely, when you provide people with spiritual psychotherapy, it's less important if they're religious or spiritual, and it's more important if they want spiritual psychotherapy. 40% of the patients in our hospital who access spiritual care have no religious or spiritual identity at all. That is, in fact, the largest group of people. They are more likely, the nuns, as we call them, N-O-N-Es. The nuns are more likely to access spiritual care than Catholics, more likely than Protestants, and certainly more than any other religious group in our hospital. And I think what that shows, sort of the combination of these different findings shows something interesting, which is that it's hard to do a sort of a head-to-head horse race, if you will, a randomized control trial of spiritual versus non-spiritual care, because if you provide spiritual care to people who don't want it, well, you can't really do that. And if you typecast them based on their religious faith, you're going to exclude a lot of people, which is something that some of the research has done in the past. And furthermore, if you provide them with secular care, if they're coming in with spiritual values, they're going to have spiritual and sacred meaning, because they bring it. It comes from them. Never mind the practitioner, it's going to have some sacred spiritual meaning. So these are conundrums and confounds, in fact, that actually make it quite difficult to assess what are the effects here and why are they happening. However, with that said, we've had a lot of success in providing spiritual care, both by clinicians and by chaplains, to individuals in mental health crisis. Over 7,000 patients at this point have received some form of spiritual care at McLean Hospital in the last 6-7 years. So pretty amazing numbers that we've been able to do, and patients with all sorts of diagnoses from all sorts of backgrounds. These treatments are well tolerated. We've actually never had a single adverse event of a spiritually integrated care patients receiving it, which is pretty amazing in the last several years. And patients with multiple diagnoses, patients with multiple backgrounds of different ages. So these treatments are tolerated well. There's a high demand for them, and to me, that's really in some ways the most important finding that we've ever had.
Do you find that patients who are receiving support from their already existing spiritual or religious community fare better in their recovery process? For example, if they are receiving, maybe if they're on a prayer chain, or they have somebody come visit them from their community who give them more support.
These types of resources do have a big difference. The question is why? Is it a matter of social support, or do these individuals just have general spiritual beliefs that are coming in, which means that they're more likely to have spiritual care, and they're also more likely to react well in treatment as a result of this. So there are these confounds which are hard to tease out. But nevertheless, I think I don't think it goes beyond our data to say that these are important resources for people with psychiatric concerns.
Perhaps social support is also a form of spirituality, in that some consider that, for example, they may think that God is love. and that through relationships we can give and receive that, which is not always readily seen, right? You can't see love.
I think that, to your point, there are many pathways to spirituality, and when people sanctify their relationships and see those as sacred, that people are brought into their lives for a reason, if you will, or that they are, relationships are not simply haphazard or coincidental, that there's, some sort of sacred meaning to them, some sort of metaphysical meaning. I do think those can supercharge our interpersonal connections. And sometimes help us to maintain them, even though they might be challenging.
Mm-hmm. So to your point earlier about how you don't want to prescribe spirituality, and like I said, I agree with you. It's very personal. At the same time, how can practitioners encourage their patients to maybe even just have a brief dialogue about it? Or how can practitioners be more aware and address this in therapy?
What we like to do is, it's called scaffolding, and scaffolding provides anchors or clear points that clinicians can ask to patients, clear language for clinicians rather to use with patients, and then tools that patients can point to, literally saying, "Oh, that's interesting to me. This is not interesting to me." We use handouts, and those handouts actually scaffold, if you will. They provide enough structure for the patient and the clinician to have a conversation about matters of spirituality without us saying, "Oh, you should really do this." Because if we're providing patients with a list of, let's say, 10 different beliefs or 20 different religious behaviors, or we're talking to them about different spiritual struggles that people might have in areas where spirituality might make it harder for them, which we haven't talked about yet, by the way. Have to circle back to that. Then those patients can point and say, "Oh, you know what? This really means something to me." And then that becomes more of a starting point for the conversation. So there are that's one of the innovations, if you will, that we've done. I've done workshops with, well over 1,000 clinicians in the past several years, training individuals to be able to assess for and address spiritual matters with their patients using some pretty simple handouts that we've published. They're in the public domain. We made them available open source because we really want clinicians around the world to be able to use these tools.
What do you mean by spiritual struggles?
So I mentioned before that there's definitely positive sides to spirituality: faith, hope, connection, regularity. But there's also negative sides when people feel abandoned by their faith, when people feel that things are happening to them that shouldn't be happening. They feel they're questioning, is this right? Is this good? I've had patients come to me and say they feel that God hates them. These are struggles. When people look inside themselves and they really don't like what they see a broken person. And that has spiritual meaning in many cases. What did I do wrong? Can I get out of this? Am I stuck? Am I spiritually stuck? Am I cursed? These are big questions, and they have a lot of emotional weight. In many cases, we've been able to trace patients' levels of suicidality, how suicidal they were when they came to the hospital, to these struggles, which is pretty remarkable. And that even occurs among secular people who have no religious faith at all. It's equally likely to occur. The prevalence of struggles and the relevance of those to mental health concerns is the same among people who are ostensibly secular, which is a really interesting finding. We've seen that in a number of papers that we've published.
Right. Sometimes people can feel like God is punishing them, or that they maybe were raised in an environment where they felt that it was even a cult, or that they even had actual abuse in the name of that particular religious organization. So what have you found that can be helpful or healing for those folks?
The most important thing that clinicians can do, and that anyone can do, is simply listen when people have struggles. There's this tendency to say, "No, God doesn't hate you," or "No, you're a good person." And I know it comes from a good place, but it's much more important to get patients to simply speak about it. In most cases that I've found, spiritual struggles are like a deep, dark secret that patients have been carrying around sometimes for 20, 30, 50 years. I saw a case recently where a man was abused by a clergy person when he was an altar boy, what age? 12, 13, 14? Happened for a couple of years. This is a man in his late 60s who had been married for 40 years, more than 40 years, multiple kids, multiple grandkids, and he never even told his wife. He never even told her. He was so ashamed and felt so degraded by what had happened to him. And simply getting him to talk about it with me, with her, with his new pastor, with a lot of other people was just a real gift for him and a real stepping stone for him to move forward in his mental health journey. For many years, he had struggled with anger and impulsivity and depression and substance abuse, and he never knew why. And, this came out, and well, maybe that's why, you've really been struggling here. And we didn't try to change it because you can't, but we just got him to speak about it in some degree of detail. And he's not struggling as much today. He still does, of course, but not nearly as much because he spoke about it.
So that maybe in some way helped decrease his stress, or what do you think was happening there that maybe he felt more accepted?
I'll tell you what I think happened.
Yeah, tell me.
I think this happens in general with people who have spiritual struggles. They feel that God hates them, and then they judge themselves for feeling that way. So just being able to speak about it gives them a reprieve of, oh, this other person's not judging me for feeling this way. I have a safe space, if you will, that I can talk about it. And then they don't feel as alone. Just validating like, oh, people say that to me all the time. They do? Yeah. Lots of patients feel that way. Oh, I didn't know that. Like, wow, maybe I'm not as evil as I thought. And for feeling this way, that's a reframe in one's own identity, which is really transformative.
You mentioned some of the struggles with religion or spirituality. What have you discovered as far as when certain religious groups feel that they have the answers, that other groups are bad or less than because they don't have those particular beliefs? And how do you find that can impact somebody's mental health? And do you have a remedy for that?
Yeah, good question. Well, first and foremost, I want to make it clear. I think all human beings have some degree of those beliefs, and whether they're religious or whether they're secular, I think, most people have their beliefs and their perspectives and are pretty convinced that those are correct. One of those beliefs might be that nobody is correct, that everybody has the same, but that's still a position. That is still, in philosophy, we call it relativism. But relativism is nevertheless a position to take in philosophy. And it's not necessarily, a bad thing. I think people need to be clear about, these are my morals, these are my values, this is what I want to accomplish, this is what I believe, this is what I don't believe. And that doesn't have to gear us up for, antipathy towards others, for judgment of others. That could actually, I believe, enhance a self-identity such that people are just clear about, this is who I am. If somebody else isn't this way, okay. Now, obviously, taking it the next step and, forced conversion or, militant activity or terrorism. Obviously that's not what I'm talking about here. But I don't think that having clear, discernible religious beliefs is a risk factor in any way for mental health. On the contrary, I think today in our post, it's the third time I'm saying this, post-modern era, where people are really confused about who am I and what's the point in life and what's my mission and what's my purpose, having those anchors, I think, can actually be very helpful and containing. Even if they're limited, I think people can still benefit from having structure, from having that structure today. And I don't see it in of itself. I don't see it leading to major mental health concerns more than any other position, more than a secular position.
However, it could impact social relationships when a person feels that maybe their religion or spiritual practice is superior to other groups. I think about Martin Buber, who talked about the other versus having a relationship of I and thou, and recognizing that we can all really coexist versus feeling that one group is better than another.
Yeah, I don't think that's inconsistent with what I'm saying. I'll be honest, working in a secular environment, for the last, 20 years, I've been in and out of universities. I've actually seen more closed-mindedness in, in the university environment than I have in even the most devout religious enclaves, because I think the reason that happens is when people aren't sure about what they themselves believe, they're much more likely to start to attack and nip at other people's beliefs, as opposed to when you're like, well, this is just who I am, and if you're not like that, then fine, that's you. Again, I don't see this as a risk factor for interpersonal disharmony in this current day and age. Now, in years past, yes, like certainly history has borne it out that way. But in the current era, that's definitely not been my experience, ironically.
Yeah. And on that note, how has, for example, the American Psychological Association accepted your research and your methodologies?
I published in APA journals. I've published in American Psychiatric Association journals, American Psychological Association journals. I think there's been a lot of change in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, and even the last 5 years, post-COVID. I think there was much more of an openness to spirituality. Where I see a disparity, which is what I think you were really asking for and leaning into, I do see a disparity when it comes to funding. That the National Institutes of Health have yet to fund an RFP, a request for proposals, or an RFA, a request for applications in this area. And it's kind of strange because this is an area of identity which is very common. It is clearly linked in positive and negative ways to a variety of mental health outcomes. And even health outcomes, physical health outcomes, never mind mental health. Yet it's the kind of thing that the academy at its highest level has really shied away from supporting. My research portfolio is almost entirely funded through private philanthropic gifts and foundations, which are sort of specifically interested in this area. Not necessarily religious foundations. Some of them are non-sectarian. Some of them are secular, in fact, but nevertheless interested in supporting this work, but without real commitment to funding from the government bodies that are behind it. There are limits to what we know, and I think that's where the disparity is, more than in the professional associations at this point in time, anyway.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any ideas as to why that's happening and what might help shift that forward in larger directions?
I'll answer the second question. In terms of shifting things forward, recently there was a special interest group, otherwise known as a SIG, special interest group, which was formed across the entire NIH, which some brave folks at the NIAAA, the National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, formed. And they've been active in creating programming and opening up a dialogue across the institutes on matters of spirituality and religion and health. And I think that's definitely a step in the right direction for the world. I think it's a necessary component of evidence-based care, since so many patients, even in the least religious enclaves, again, of the United States, still have religious and spiritual beliefs. Spirituality is still relevant to their treatment and relevant to their symptoms. So I do think these are all positive steps in the right direction, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time. We talked at the beginning about the roots laid down by Sigmund Freud and colleagues at the beginning of the outset of the field of psychiatry, and those are still very common. They're still prevalent.
An area that's getting more attention is psychedelics for the treatment of mental health. What have you found with your research, or what thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, psychedelics is very exciting. We have here a neurotherapeutic process, which is being combined in some ways with a spiritual experience for many people. And And when it comes to treatment refractory depression, people who have had depression for multiple years, there are cases, at least, of people having what we call breakthroughs, where all of a sudden, they're seeing things in a different light. I have a colleague who's been using psychedelics to enhance couples therapy and to enhance intimate connection, and having sort of a combination of spiritual and interpersonal processes going on together, which is pretty interesting. There's, certainly literature emerging about people getting unstuck and people who are seeing new vistas or having new experiences that sort of break them out of a certain way of thinking that they've been stuck in for 5, 10, 15, 20, even longer, many years. With all that sort of encouraging, positive material coming out, the data is still very, very early. And, there are only a couple of labs that are really taking this extremely seriously and studying it methodically. I think we're at least 5 years away from having a clarity. And I also think one thing that's getting missed a little bit is that people are engaging in the substance aspects of it, the actual, use of the psychedelics, without having clear guidelines for how to engage with spiritual domains. And I think this is powerful medicine. We talked about it beforehand. There's positive and negative effects. And we really do need to be able to harness it well in a constructive manner. So I think in some ways the research and the use of the pharmacological agent is outpacing the psychosocial aspects of treatment, what treatment might look like. So that's a little bit of an area of a concern for me. But with that said, I think it's a positive movement overall, and we'll have to see where it goes.
You're at Harvard, where Herbert Benson is, I believe, professor emeritus, and he coined the term the relaxation response, where he studied transcendental meditators and people who prayed, nuns and monks, and devised a whole way for people to engage the relaxation response, where it can even help down to the genetic level with positive expressions of the genes. What have you found around the benefits or the risks of prayer or meditation currently with your work?
Yeah, it's a great question. A little bit of history here, just interestingly, Herb Benson really was the father of mind-body medicine. And he did such an amazing job, amazing work, really showing the field that the way that people think has an indelible effect on their health, on the way that their body functions day to day, at the molecular level, at the genetic level, at all sorts of levels, because of a variety of clear pathways. Spirituality, I would say, is a subset of mind-body medicine, because when people are engaged in spiritual aspects, that's really a way of engaging the mind, if you will, and the heart, I suppose, and the soul, or whatever that is, and that has health effects too. So, in some ways, spirituality and mental health research is a subset of mind-body medicine, and I certainly owe a lot of gratitude to Herb Benson and his work and his colleagues' work in breaking down the barriers. With that said, I do think mind and body medicine has fallen short of actually embracing and really going into the realm of spirituality. And the reason why, when the field was getting set up, now at this point, 30, 40 years ago, it was already out there enough, right? It was a big stretch for the field to think that the mind could have an impact on the body. I mean, that was a big idea. And to add spirituality to that would have been like a conversation killer. That would have just been the end of it. And I think with things have evolved in a positive way, that now mind-body medicine is sort of understood to be just part of what we have to do, whether it's in migraines or even in infertility. I mean, there's fantastic research going on, and certainly in mental health, we have the clear effects of in importance of mind-body medicine. And that's all given way to be able to address issues of spirituality, which are often more core to people when you ask them.
Meditation has become more popular, with yoga being on almost every corner in every city and town across the U.S. More people are engaging in meditation. and maybe even prayer. What have you found in your research when you look at those practices of meditation and prayer on how a person's health might be impacted?
We've done some research that suggests that the extent to which people pray on a regular basis, if it's once a month or if it's not at all versus once a month versus once a week versus daily, that can have some effects on buffering them against impulsivity, buffering them against suicidality, helping them to get through substance abuse and alcohol abuse, and the like. Meditation, I know less about, just because I have colleagues who've been studying this, for many years and are really much more, experts in this area. And my area is sort of more niche and specific, which is one of the reasons I've shied away from it. But there's really fascinating research on meditation and depression in particular, and the importance of these, if you will, spiritual practices that have been around for millennia. Is I think clear and demonstrable, and I wouldn't say uniformly positive, but generally speaking, there are a lot of potential benefits of engaging in these practices, at least somewhat regularly from a mental health perspective.
David, is there anything else you want to share today about how spirituality can enhance mental health?
I think it's great to be having a conversation about this. I think it's the kind of topic that was eschewed for most of the 20th century, and here we are, and really moving into a more open spiritual zeitgeist within the field of mental health. I think it's an exciting time to be doing this type of work and research. I do hope that the future will see much more of an understanding of spirituality and mental health, and more clinical innovation, so we can help the as many patients as we possibly can.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all that you're doing in this area. And thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to having more conversations with you on New Thinking Aloud.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we are here.
I imagine that by now many of you already realize that, in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death?